In this video, we are going to see the changes that have been introduced in PHP 8.0 starting from PHP 7.4. In this first part, we are going to see the backward and compatible changes, and then in a second video, we are going to see the new features. In order for us to execute our scripts against two versions of PHP, I have defined a Docker Compose file where I create two services. The first service will be named PHP 74, which will be containing PHP 7.4 CLI image. The second service, PHP 80, will be running PHP 8.0 CLI image. Down here I have two terminals, one on the left and the second on the right. On the left hand side, I'm going to get into a container running PHP 7.4 CLI image. So I'm going to execute this command over here, and then I'm going to cd to my source, which is under PHP 7.4 src bc. I'm going to do the same thing for PHP 8.0. I'm going to cd to the source. If I execute php-v in my container, I'm going to have PHP 8.0 for the right hand container, and if I do the same php-v in my left hand container, I'm going to have PHP 7.4. So we can now execute our scripts against two versions of PHP. Let's get started with the backward and compatible changes. The first one will be concerning strings to number comparison. Non-strict comparison between numbers and non-numeric strings now will be working by casting the number to a string and comparing the two strings. What we mean by non-numeric strings, this 42 foo, for example, is a non-numeric string because it contains some strings and other characters that are not string. This empty string also is a non-numeric string, and foo, for example, also is a non-numeric string. In PHP 7.4, if I execute this script over here, I'm going to have true for all values. Why? Because we are casting the values on the left, the strings, into integers and comparing them on the values that we have on the left hand side, which are equals. Now for PHP 8.0, this is going to change for non-numeric strings, which are this value, and this value over here. So if you compare the values, we should be seeing the same result as PHP 7.4, except for foo, empty string, and 42 foo. Why? Because we are comparing the integers into strings and then comparing the two values. So here I'm going to have false, same goes for foo, and also for 42 foo. This case is especially tricky. We have to be paying extra attention to this case in particular, because in many cases we are considering an empty string as 0 or false, which will be breaking our code in PHP 8.0. So this is the first change. The second change is that now mixed and match are reserved keywords in PHP. So they can no longer be used as classes, interfaces, traits, etc. So if I execute this code in PHP 7.4, I'm not going to have an error, so PHP will not throw an error whatsoever. But if I execute the same code in PHP 8.0, I'm going to have an error for match. And if I comment this part over here, I'm going to have an error for mixed as well. Let's try that out. And I do have an error for mixed. So mixed and match are now two reserved keywords in PHP 8. The third change is for constructors. In older versions of PHP, especially in a very old code, we can define constructors with functions that have the same name as the class name. So this function over here in PHP 7.4 and below is considered as a constructor. Let's try that out in PHP 7.4. So if I execute this code, I do have this display over here in my terminal, meaning that when I created a new instance of A, this function is called, which is a way of saying that this is a constructor, which means that this is a constructor of my class A. Now in PHP 7.8, if I execute the same code, I am probably not going to have this display. Let's try that out. And I don't have that display. Why? Because in PHP 8.0, this way of defining constructor is removed. And the only way to have constructor is by using the magic function __ construct. So if I execute this code now in PHP 8, I'm going to have this constructor called. That's the third change. The fourth change is for arrays. In PHP 7.4, if we define an array that have -5 as index and -5 as string for value, and then we create a new item with -4 as value, the index, the internal index, is going to be 0. This has been changed in PHP 8.0 to be -5 plus 1, which is -4. Let's try this out. If I execute this code over here, I'm going to have an array with -5, and then the value is -5 as string. The second value is going to have an index 0. This has been changed in PHP 8.0 because it is kind of inconsistent way to create new items of an array. So it is now have been changed to -4. So the first item is -5. We have created a new item. It makes sense to have -4 rather than 0 as index because we are incrementing the index. That's the first change. The second change is concerning array kExist function. In PHP 7.4, we can use this function to check if a property exists on an object or no. Say for example that I have this new object that contains a property named count, and I want to check if this object contains a property named count. In PHP 7.4, this is a perfectly valid code. It will be checking for me whether I have count inside object, and it should return me true. Let's try that out. And indeed it returned for me true. Now if I test the same code in PHP 8.0, I'm going to have an error. Why? Because array kExist now accepts only arrays as second argument. Now let's move to the fifth change, which considered that lines that start with hash no longer commands. Why? Because we are going to use this notation over here to design attributes, which is a new feature introduced in PHP 8. So this code over here for PHP 7.4 is perfectly valid. If I execute this code in PHP 7.4, I'm not going to have an error. Technically, this is an empty file in PHP 7.4 because it contains a single command which is ignored by the compiler. Now, if I run this in PHP 8.0, I'm going to have an error saying that I cannot parse this because this is a attribute syntax, and apparently this way of defining attributes is not good for PHP 8.0. But the important thing is that this is no longer ignored and it is no more a command in PHP 8.0. The change number 6 is concerning LSP errors. LSP stands for Liskov substitution principle, which is a principle that says if we substitute a superclass object reference with an object of any of its subclasses, the program should not break. Let's take an example. Here I'm having C1 as superclass, and then I'm having C2 which extends C1. They both define a method. Now if I create, for example, an object, let's call it say X. X stands for 1 or 2, and then I'm going to create a new instance of C1. I can now call on CX method, which is this method over here. I can pass it an array. Let's give it an array of a single item, which is 0. Liskov substitution principle says that this instance CX can now of superclass can be changed with any of its subclasses, meaning C2. So if I replace C1 with C2, my program should not break. Or here the method of C2 is taking an integer, and here is taking an array. So my program will break because I'm going to have this exact error which says expected parameter of type int, and then we have an array of integer provided instead of that. So here we are violating Liskov substitution principle, and our code will not be working. Let's go back to the differences that we are going to have between PHP 7.4 and PHP 8. In PHP 7.4, for this case over here, I'm going to have a warning, and for this case, I'm going to have an error. Why? Because in this case, I'm using class extension, and in this case, I'm using interfaces, or as a more general rule, I'm using abstract functions. So if I execute this code in PHP 7.4, I'm going to have a warning concerning C1 and C2, and then an error for this block of code. Now in PHP 8.0, I'm going to have errors for both cases. So let's try that out. If I execute the same code, I'm going to have an error for C2. And if I command this code, because the execution of my script got halted, now I'm going to command this part over here and try to reach this part, and I should be having an error as well. So again, I'm going to have an error. So the change between 7.4 and 7.8 is that now each time we violate LSP principle, we are going to have a fatal error instead of sometimes warning and sometimes an error. That's the change number 6. Now the change number 7 is for the concatenation operator precedence. In PHP 7.4, if I var dump this expression over here, I'm going to have the equivalent of this. So I'm going to have sum concatenated to a, the variable a, and all that, the result of this will be added to b. So I'm going to have 0 plus 1, which should be 0 plus 2, sorry, which should be 2. In PHP 8.0, I'm going to have a plus b executed first. So the plus operator has a higher priority than the concatenation operator. So I'm going to have sum and then 3. Let's try that out. In PHP 7.4, if I execute this, I'm going to have a warning and then 2 for this first display, which will be giving me 0 plus 2 and then 0 minus 2. So I'm going to have 2 and minus 2. In PHP 8.0, if I execute the same script, I'm going to have 3 and minus 1. The last change is concerning trait signatures. In PHP 8.0, the signatures of abstract methods defined in traits is now checked against the implementation in a class method. Say that I define a trait over here and then I have an abstract method named needed by trait. This method is defining a string as a return type, and I'm using this trait over here in my class. Then afterwards I'm defining again the same function with integer as a return type. This code will be generating an error in PHP 8.0, but it will generate no error in PHP 7.4. Let's try that out. If I execute this script over here, in PHP 7.4 I have no error whatsoever, but in PHP 8.0 I should be having an error saying that declaration of my class needed by trait int must be compatible with my trait needed by trait. So we do have PHP 8.0 checking whether this declaration of function over here is compatible with what we have here, because we are using the trait that is defined here. That's it for the backward and compatible changes. I'm going to be asking some questions to help you stick some information that we have seen together in this video in your head, so feel free to answer these questions in the comments section.